So I'm really pleased to introduce our first speaker of the day, China Williams, who's an old colleague and friend of mine who's been really supportive and helped me navigate various policy issues in the past. So I'm really happy to be hosting her. China is a senior policy officer at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, where she leads on implementation of the Convention on Biological Diversity and related international environmental legislation. She has a really interesting background. She was originally a barrister, but since moving into policy, she now works across Kew to ensure that plant material is accessed and used in line with national legislation. She also represents Kew and the UK at international biodiversity meetings, as well as teaching on Kew's 3 master's courses. So today, China's going to be speaking about the Convention on Biological Diversity and its Nagoya Protocol, and she'll be sharing some of her reflections and experiences from her work at Kew. Thank you, China.
Thank you very much, Mimi, and thanks everyone for being here and for inviting me. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully it will work. Is that good? Can everybody see it? Yes?
Yeah, they can see.
Great. Okay. So I'm going to talk to you today as Mimi said, a bit around the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Nagoya Protocol, and just a bit about my experience at working at Kew. So, as most of you probably know, Royal Botanic Gardens Kew is kind of a range of different things. It's a botanic garden. It's also a public visitor attraction with over 2 million visitors a year. But also importantly, it's a science research institution with now, I think, over 500 scientists working at Kew doing research. And we have a mission to understand and protect plants and fungi for the well-being of people and the future of all life on Earth. And so that kind of guides the way that we work. We are a collection-based institution, so we have, as I said, actually over 700 scientists now. We have huge collections. We have over 8.5 million dried herbarium and fungi specimens. We have a DNA bank. We have in the seed bank in Wakehurst Place over 2 billion seeds. We also have obviously a living collection, the garden itself that you can visit, but also about over 17,000 species in cultivation. We have a really important library and archive collection with books and archive, with paintings, pictures and notebooks. And we have an important economic botany collection as well. And it's dynamic, I would say. So we currently work with over 100 countries. Sorry, I'm just going to move the screen so that I can see my slides a bit better. He collaborates with partners in more than 110 countries, and staff continue to go on around 60 collecting expeditions each year to different countries to bring back seeds and plants, and we have an active exchange program as well. So there is plant material coming in and out of Kew. I think around 60,000 specimens coming in and out of the herbarium, maybe 30,000 seeds and live plant, obviously more seeds, but live plants. And we need to, we're working in a different framework than historically. So I think important to talk about is some of the older members of the audience will remember the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, which really agreed the international framework within which we work. So there were 3 new international conventions agreed in Rio. There was the one on biodiversity, the CBD. There was the Climate Change Convention, which is probably the most high profile of those 3, and also the Convention on Desertification. And those 3 conventions agreed, and under the United Nations, they really became the framework for global action to protect the environment. And they came out of a lot of discussion in the late 80s and 1990s around needing global action rather than each country working on their own, and that the environment was something that people needed to work together on. So the convention that kind of I'm going to talk about really today is the Convention on Biological Diversity, or CBD for short, and that has three objectives. It's a huge and wide-reaching convention that's often referred to as the kind of overarching one. Its first objective is the conservation of biodiversity. The second objective is around using biodiversity sustainably, and the sort of academic in academic circles in the 80s and 90s, the idea of sustainability had come from the Brundtland report, and it was this kind of balance between sort of humans and nature, and the fact that we needed to conserve biodiversity, but there was also a recognition that biodiversity was incredibly important for human life, and that it needs to be used sustainably, and there was that needed to be dealt with together, rather than possibly the earlier approaches to nature protection, which had mainly been around protected areas and keeping humans and nature sort of separate. And then there was this third objective to the CBD, this idea that the benefits of biodiversity needs to be equally and fairly distributed, and that would go back to the holders of that, but the original holders of that biodiversity, in order to help them support biodiversity. So I think that was remains kind of one of the most political aspects of the CBD, and really a recognition that biodiversity is not equally distributed, and that some countries, particularly poorer countries, have a greater burden for protecting biodiversity, and that there should be a mechanism to support that. Parties to the CBD meet every 2 years at a conference of the parties, which is a COP, which is probably a word that you've heard quite a lot. A COP can refer to any conference of the parties. I know it's used a lot in the media to mean the Climate Change Convention, but it's just basically means it's like it's just the meeting of a COP meeting of the parties. So COP15, which was the 15th meeting, took place in December 2022 in Montreal, and that agreed the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which is the new framework going forward for global action on biodiversity. And the next COP for the CBD will be COP16. It will be in Cali in Colombia, and it will be this year in October 2024. So just to kind of bit of a background on COPs, because when I said I was going to COP15, even my children thought, "Oh, I thought we were on COP26." So I always have a bit. I'm always like, no, biodiversity COPs. I know it. So just to sort of have a little bit of a difference between biodiversity COPs, climate change COPs. Biodiversity COPs tend to focus on conserving biological diversity, using biodiversity sustainably. They produce targets and frameworks to halt biodiversity loss. There isn't a headline target for the biodiversity COP, and there's no common metric, because biodiversity is really complicated and messy. Climate change COPs focus on preventing dangerous human interference with the climate system, and they have produced this headline target, which has been a very useful sort of, particularly framing for countries and also the media, this 1.5 safe limit that was agreed in the Paris Agreement. And they work with a common metric, which is greenhouse gas emissions, and they do tend to generate more engagement for the finance sector, which is becoming a bit of a problem for the biodiversity COP. I think people tend to forget about the importance of biodiversity, and its importance to underlining it. It's medicine, it's food, it's not just animals, it's plants. There's a lot of plant blindness in this area. It supports livelihoods, and it regulates climate. So I think there's a lot of awareness raising to be done around the importance of biodiversity and how important it is for life. So the CBD, or the Biodiversity Convention, set out really what was a new framework for accessing plants and animals for research and commercialization. And what the CBD said in its Article 15 was that anybody who wanted to access plants and animals needed to follow national laws, needed to get consent from the provider for the use of that material, who needed to agree terms and to share the benefits fairly and equitably. And now most countries do have laws on collecting plants and animals and how you can use them and who and what you need to share. So CBD is pretty much the most ratified convention now. It has 196 parties, that's 195 countries and the European Union. It's a binding agreement between nation states or parties that form the basis of international law. So a party is a country that has ratified the CBD by making a formal declaration to incorporate the convention into national legislation. So in the UK, that means that it's gone through the House of Parliament and the House of Lords and become integrated into UK law. And then there have been a series of individual bits of legislation that implement the various articles of the CBD. There are only 2 UN recognized states that are non-parties, and that's the USA and the Vatican. So I think it's important to note that only parties, only countries, not individuals like you and I, not institutions like Kew or the Royal Society of Biology, or are obliged to comply with the CBD. So we, as individuals and institutions, we comply with the national law implemented by our countries or the countries in which we're working. And it's up to the UK government to implement the CBD through national law. So it works, as I said, through a COP, a Conference of the Parties, which meets every 2 years. And anybody can go to a COP, really. Obviously, there are the representatives of all the parties. There will also be representatives of non-parties. So the United States will send a delegation. There are also NGOs, academia, industry, finance, and many delegations of Indigenous communities, Indigenous peoples and local communities, including farmers. In between the COPs, it's a bit like with the Paris Agreement, there is a kind of science aspect, which is called SUBSTA, the subsidiary body on scientific, technical and technological advice. And scientific experts meet in the intersessional period. So that's kind of the time between the COPs when the work gets done. And that's kind of now, really. So I was recently in Nairobi for a week or 2 where there were intersessional meetings where parties are getting together and basically preparing the papers that will be discussed and decided at the COP later in the year. There's a clearinghouse mechanism, which is essentially a website which facilitates an exchange of information. And there's a secretariat based in Montreal. And then each country will have a national focal point, which is the point of contact for what's going on with implementing the CBD. So in the UK, that's Defra. So the COP15 in Montreal was a really important COP. It was a rollover from 2020, which was supposed to be the big year for biodiversity, and there was supposed to be the big COP was supposed to be in China in Kunming, but because of COVID, it was delayed, and it did eventually happen in December 22, and it was hailed as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to tackle the biodiversity crisis. It was really the setting of the new targets. So we had targets that lasted to 2020, and this was setting the new targets. And countries did agree the post-2020 global biodiversity framework with new targets and a global plan to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. I mean, I have to say, all previous targets set by the CBD none of them have ever been met, and governments need to ensure that this new framework really leads to new action on the ground, and it's been designed in a bit of a different way to help that happen. And one of the approaches is that this framework is a whole of government, whole of society approach. So I think previously, often in environmental matters in different countries have been dealt with environment, people involved with the environment, but actually, of course, it needs to be mainstreamed into all aspects of society, of planning, of finance, business, tourism, education, everything. So it's a whole of government, whole of society approach. And this is the hashtag that is being used. So everyone is urged to be part of the plan, hashtag part of the plan. Just to give you a bit of an idea of what kind of a COP meeting is like. There will be kind of formal negotiations where parties it's quite open, so even if you're an observer, you can sit at the back. There will be not in every single session, but most sessions. So there will be formal negotiations, there will be delegations from all parties, quite big delegations in some cases, maybe 10 or 20 people. And those party delegations will include representatives maybe from science or even indigenous communities if that country has a large community. There are also involvement from stakeholders like youth groups, and women's groups have had a lot more involvement in the process in the last 5 years or so. Scientists and indigenous communities. There will be side events every lunchtime, and after the end of the conference, there will be side events where people will be sharing ideas and giving presentations on papers or ideas that they've had. There will be protests and also information sharing events. So the photos I'm showing you are from a working group meeting in Nairobi in June 2022, but I think they give a good reflection of the kind of range of activities that will happen over what is a 2-week process. So also in Cali in Colombia, where the COP is going to be later this year, there will kind of be 2 venues. I don't know if any of you went to Glasgow, but you'll see the same thing, where there'll be the formal negotiations in one venue, but there will be lots of all the side events, the science forum, the indigenous forum, the finance stuff will all be happening there. And then also in Cali, there's going to be a more civil society sort of bit where there will be more outreach events for children, young people, students, and anyone in Cali who's interested in it. So there'll be probably quite high profile. So also just to give you an idea about how the process of negotiation works, I think I don't know if you've any of you've been to a sort of negotiation, but the CBD is quite unusual, or in that everybody has a say, everybody has a chance to speak, and decisions are reached by consensus. So it's a slow kind of whittling down of language that will be acceptable. So for instance, this is on screen, I've got the kind of development of target 2, and you can see the things in brackets would be the words that are undecided. So while things are being kind of decided, is it going to be 20%? Is it 30%? They'll be put in brackets until there's been a discussion, a long, lengthy discussion, and the parties in the room, and helped by the co-chairs and the secretariat, will try and come with a text that eventually everyone agrees to. And if one person doesn't agree to it, it won't go. So it has to be, it's a long process of development, which is really kind of interesting to watch, can be quite frustrating, but I guess does come to a point where everyone has accepted the decisions, which is important when going forward countries have to then go back and implement that in national law. So I think some key themes just to draw your attention to in the new framework, and one of them is around the more rights-based approach, and the fact that Indigenous peoples and local communities' rights and knowledge are now much more embedded within the framework's targets than they were before. There was quite a lot of criticism of past decision making within the CBD failing to recognise the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities, particularly around sort of protected areas and protected area management. And the new targets, especially the ones on target 3, which is the 30 by 30 protected area target, really ensures that parties proactively involve these communities to tackle land ownership and incentives. And I think, you know, everyone's agreed that the involvement of IPLCs is critical to achieve the best conservation outcomes. Indigenous communities make up 5% of the world's population and are stewards and guardians and look after 80% of its biodiversity. So it's crucial that they're not excluded from this process in all the planning around it. So there was a lot of discussion around the development of what has become one of the key targets, the 30 by 30, the fact that there will be, and governments will designate 30% of their land and ocean area as protected areas by 2030. There were kind of good things about this target, which is that, you know, as we've seen, numerical goals can be very clear, can be very easy to communicate, can be good to work towards. And designating areas of high biodiversity protection seems to be a good plan when there's maybe little species level information, where you don't have that information. There was debate about whether 30% was the right figure, whether it was the right figure for everyone. There are different countries have different abilities to achieve that. Some countries it's easier than others. It was argued that it skewed in favour of the global north rather than local communities and farmers. And there was also a sort of quality, not quantity, which was that, you know, there wasn't much measure around, you know, you could designate 30, but which 30 and how was it going to be monitored? So for those of you that are interested, you don't have to read it through now, but obviously you can look later. That is the target. And I think one of the important things as well, that it includes not just protected areas, but also this idea of other effective area-based conservation measures, which do and better recognise Indigenous and traditional territories. Another big aspect of the framework and something going forward is this basically the money. Where's the money coming from? And many countries involved in agreeing the framework back in 2022 were saying, you know, it's all very well to have this framework and these ambitious plans, but we need funds. We also need capacity and technology in place to support implementation of the framework. And there was a lot of debate about agreeing the framework without more commitments from governments and also private finance to help support it. So there's a lot still. This is a lot to be decided and to be you know, to be worked out. There is some alignment of the biodiversity targets for to integrate within the financial sector. There's work being done on reducing subsidies that harm nature and transferring that money. And there's also a big push for an increase in private sector investment in nature conservation, which really needs to increase if this funding gap is going to be closed. So to meet the climate change and biodiversity targets, we really need to, it's been estimated we need to close a $4.1 trillion financing gap by 2050. So when the plan was agreed, there's 4 long-term goals and 23 action-orientated global targets, and then there is a monitoring framework around that, which some of you might have been involved in. And I think, again, looking again at this whole of society, whole of government approach, there are lots of themes that when implementing the framework with this more human rights-based approach, countries are really need to look at different value systems, gender, right to development, intergenerational equity, and there's a whole list that the framework needs to be seen in the context of all these things. Just wanted to take you back because I think that it's important to remember the kind of plants that sort of set this whole process off. And when just before the CBD was negotiated back in 1992, one of the plants that was almost like the poster plant for those negotiations was the Madagascan periwinkle. This is a picture of the Madagascan periwinkle that we have at Kew. Looks like quite an innocuous plant, but it had been used in traditional medicine to treat diabetes. And trials by drug companies found that it contained chemical compounds that have powerful anti-cancer properties. It was licensed, marketed, and is used extensively in the treatment of childhood leukemia. And it's actually really turned around the treatment of childhood leukemia to have have a much better outcome than before this treatment. And the question, that came up in the early 90s was, should Madagascar get a share of the profits? And that's really what set off that debate around access and benefit sharing, and the idea that countries that are the provider countries of some of these important plants and animals that are used by business, that are used by business, should actually have some of the profits. And so that was really one of the kind of incentives for the negotiation of the third objective of the CBD. And it also went on to frame a protocol of the CBD called the Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing, which I'm going to talk about now. And I think also, just to give an example from Kew, probably all have heard of the rubber tree, the primary source of natural rubber native to Brazil. In 1876, Henry Wickham, who was working at Kew, he collected 70,000 seedlings in Brazil, and he brought them to Kew by ship. The seedlings were he got an export. He did pay export taxes on the seedlings, and those seedlings were grown up at Kew and propagated and sent around the world, and basically used to establish the colonial rubber industry in Malaysia, as well as West Africa. And at that time, obviously, no legislation existed in Brazil to prevent that export, but things are very different now. Brazil does have very strict legislation on material leaving Brazil, and strict rules on what should be shared and how much. So, as I said, just to bring you back to Article 15 of the CBD, which really sets this framework, which says follow national laws, get prior informed consent from the provider, mutually agree terms, share benefits. And that was aiming to provide an incentive for conservation and sustainable use, and to actually feed money back as well. After the CBD came into effect, countries introduced legislation. There was a lot of emphasis on this, that finally money was going to come back. Many countries did have procedures on how to collect material, maybe permits for national parks, letters from ministries, but they weren't always clear. Terms varied widely. And so users, whether they'd be botanic gardens collecting plants, or academic researchers doing their PhDs, as well as commercial companies and drug companies, were left unsure of what they could do with material when they came back and started doing research or R&D. And it was very much up to provider countries to set the rules to enforce them. But once the material was out of the country, there was no compliance procedure in the user country to ensure that those laws were followed. And that really led to a lack of trust of the provider countries, fear of misuse of their genetic resources, and what was termed biopiracy. So that led to the development of a more legally binding regime, and negotiations began in 2002, and they were finally agreed in Nagoya in 2010 at COP10, and that protocol came into effect in 2014, which was basically 90 days after the 50th ratification. The protocol is legally binding, but in the same way as the CBD, the text is subject to national implementation. So you and I, Kew, Royal Society of Biology, we're not subject to the Nagoya Protocol. It's the UK that has signed the Nagoya Protocol, and we are subject to the national legislation of countries where we're working, whether that be the UK or Ethiopia or Kenya or Indonesia. So the protocol says that there should be benefit sharing from utilization, which it defines as research and development. It says that parties may implement access requirements, But importantly, what it says is that parties that are parties to the protocol must introduce a compliance, some sort of compliance measures to ensure those genetic resources have been legally accessed, monitor utilization, and address situations of non-compliance. And there are now 140 parties to the protocol, and most have implemented legislation to some degree. So if you're working in a party to the protocol, it's very likely that it will have legislation on how you access genetic resources and what you can do with them. Still are challenges, though. It does provide some clarity, but it is implemented, as I said, on a national level. And so there are 140 different parties and they have different approaches. And one of my jobs at Kew is really to keep track of all the different bits of legislation. So if colleagues at Kew are traveling, they need to make sure that they know what the current procedures are in those countries. The definition of access varies. So in some cases, it can also include access to material in the ex situ collections. That's the case with some French territories. And it can also include access to information from databases, for instance, in the case of Ethiopia and Brazil. And in other cases, the definition and scope of what genetic resource is varies. So it can include derivatives. It can include associated traditional knowledge, or again, in the case of Brazil, they use the term genetic heritage, and that includes information as well as material. And also there are differences in what constitutes use or utilization. Is it just research and development, and what does that mean? And all those obligations are set out in national legislation. They're in permits and bilateral agreements, and users need to ensure compliance and keep track of that. So in the UK now, the UK is a party to the protocol, and it does have regulations on which implement it. They're called the Nagoya Protocol on access and they're called the ABS regulations. Sorry, and they were introduced in 2015, and they apply to anyone in the UK conducting research and development on genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge. They apply if you access that material or knowledge after the 12th of October 2014 from a country that's a party to the protocol and does have access measures, and when the utilization takes place in the UK. And if you tick all those boxes, you need to make a due diligence declaration that those genetic resources have been legally accessed, and you need to provide evidence that the material was obtained. So you need to come up with all the permits, and you need to send those to the Office of OPSS, which is within BES in the UK government. And then there are obviously fines for not doing that. But at the moment, the UK is around awareness raising and really trying to help people comply and understand the legislation, and also be aware of the legislation. One issue that has become a bit a very debated topic at the moment is the issue around digital sequence information. So if you heard what I've been saying over the last half an hour or so, you will realize that the CBD negotiated in 1992 really very much focused on material, on physical material. And of course, things have changed a lot from the 1990s now, and researchers and innovators and developers use a lot of information. They use a lot of digital sequence information. There's a huge increase in the creation and use of digital sequence information. It's also become much cheaper to create and much cheaper to share. It now underpins most research, actually, and it's vital to identification, to really important things like tackling wildlife crime, to developing new vaccines like the COVID-19 vaccine, to improving crops, medicines, etc. So it's crucial. But in most cases, the use of DSI and benefit sharing is not actually covered by the Nagoya Protocol. And sometimes we have terms and agreements that cover it. And in some cases, like with Ethiopia, they do require PIC for access to DSI. Many countries feel that it's unfair that benefits from the use of information about their plants and animals doesn't generate the benefits in the way that genetic resources do. So what happened in COP15 was that there was an agreement that benefits should be shared from the use of digital sequence information. There was also an agreement that there should be open access to this information because it's vital for research and conservation and for a whole manner of things like drug developments, etc. And what the parties agreed that there should be some kind of multilateral mechanism that should be established, which would be a fair and cost-effective way to operationalize this and to share that money. And the parties at COP15 agreed a roadmap. And there have been 2 open meetings in November and May, and there's going to be another one actually in August. And that should be adopted in October. The UK and Malawi are chairing those meetings, and they are aiming for a solution that will be operational and will produce a significant amount of revenue. And there's a big need to engage all stakeholders, business, academia, in IPLCs in actually coming up with this solution. Just coming to an end now, but I just wanted just to sort of get you thinking, you probably can think of examples yourself, but thinking about fairness and equity around development. So something that's had quite a lot of attention is Hoodia, which is a succulent which is endemic to South Africa, Botswana, and Namibia, and it was historically used to stave off hunger pangs based on traditional knowledge of the San people. There was a lot of work in the 1970s in South Africa to look at interesting plants that might be used and developed. There was work done by CSIR. It was licensed to Phytofarm and eventually Unilever in 2004, and they did a lot of work to develop a diet supplement. There's quite a bit of bad publicity around the Phytofarm and Unilever deal, and that led to a retrospective benefit sharing agreement being negotiated with the San people, which would give them some social benefits, things like setting up schools and health centres, and also the promise of 6 to 8% of any commercial profits. Unfortunately, the Unilever dropped the development of Hoodia. You can buy Hoodia in lots of health food shops, but there's no evidence of prior informed consent benefit sharing. So I think that's the importance of some kind of access and benefit sharing agreement and solution being in place. Another example is the Ethiopian cereal teff, which is naturally gluten-free, and it's attracted a lot of interest in the food industry. In 2005, there was a 10-year ABS agreement between the Ethiopian Agricultural Research Institute and a Dutch company, and a huge amount of work went into that negotiation. But the Dutch company eventually folded and no benefits were shared to Ethiopia. And again, teff is something that you can buy. I think you can even buy it in Waitrose. Turmeric, again, long been used medicinally. In the 90s, a patent was granted to a US university on the wound healing properties of turmeric. They're well known in Ayurvedic traditional healers in India. And the Indian Council of Scientific and Industrial Research used 1,000-year-old Sanskrit writings to revoke that patent by proving that the use and the patent was neither a discovery nor novel. And that patent had given exclusive rights to sell and distribute turmeric, which raised concerns that current patent systems are unable to protect source countries and indigenous communities. And that was very much revoked on the basis of something that the Indian government have established, which is a traditional knowledge digital library, where they have basically uploaded all the Ayurvedic and other information around traditional use in India. It's uploaded, it's online, it's available in a number of different languages, and it can be searched directly by patent offices in Australia, Japan, everywhere. And there are also recent discussions within WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, to try and ensure that prior traditional knowledge should be checked before a patent is granted. But some patent offices have taken that up, but not all. So I think just to leave you with sort of 5 key messages around biodiversity that I think we all need to promote. And I think increasingly what I've realized with talking, especially to friends and family, outside Kew, is that there's really, and also, reading papers, listening to the news, and realizing how little biodiversity is talked about in comparison, particularly to climate change. But that biodiversity is critical to our lives. The rate we're losing it is accelerating at an unprecedented rate. Key research shows that 2 in 5 plants face extinction, but people are not really as aware of this compared to the more visible threats we face from climate change. We need action this decade to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. We need to support all countries that we're working with in partnerships to achieve these ambitious targets. We need more funding, capacity building, and technical and scientific cooperation to make any difference by 2030 in the short term, 2050 in the long term. We need to work to implement the GBF targets. We need science, research, and experience to work with our partners and countries to ensure progress is secured. I think also we need to do more work to discuss the fact that climate and biodiversity crises are intertwined. They need to be addressed together. One is exacerbated by the other, but we also know that nature is key to reaching net zero and can also provide us with many of the solutions and challenges we face. Next year, COP30, the climate change COP30 is going to be in Belém in Brazil, and I think the interweaving of climate and biodiversity will be really apparent and a big message from there. And I think also we need to make sure that that functional multinational mechanism to share benefits from the use of biodiversity information does become operational, that there's real buy-in from all aspects of society, whether it be business, researchers, or Indigenous communities, and that could make a real difference to the funding gap and support countries conserve biodiversity. Thank you very much, and I hope I didn't go over time, and I think probably have some time for questions.
Thank you so much, China. Wow, that's such a complicated sort of area to navigate, and I bow to anyone.
Can you hear me?
Navigate it and sort of help to make it sort of the implementation workable. We've got some time for questions. Just to remind everyone, if you'd like to ask China a question, you can raise your hand using the raise hand function in your Zoom window, which you'll see under, I believe it's under the reactions button. And then when I ask you, you can unmute your microphone and ask the question. Alternatively, just type your question into the chat box and I'll keep an eye on it and read it out when I see them come in as well. The first one's from Celia Knight. She said, excellent talk, China, thank you. She said, can you say anything more about how the hashtag part of the plan initiative will be used to engage necessary sectors of society?
Yeah, so I was just saying that part of the UN drive to engage all aspects, and I guess it's just like a common hashtag to be used. I think it's something that basically we should all be getting involved in and link together all aspects. So yeah, it's not yet. It's coming out of that hashtag part of the plan is coming out of the Secretariat to the CBD.
Okay, great, thank you. And we've got a question also from Katie Davis, who also says thank you for a really great talk. She wanted to know about sharing lab strains or genetically modified plant samples between labs across countries. So would those fall under the Nagoya Protocol?
Well, again, it just depends on national law. So it depends on the country, the permissions that you got with the original material from which you did the sequencing. So some countries will cover that, some countries won't. So it's just down to national law.
Thanks, China.
You just need to check each. Yeah, you'll just need to check each transaction. That's the difficulty.
Yeah, I had a question actually, China, about you know, we were talking about sort of the definitions of genetic resources and access. In terms of benefits, are we just talking financial benefits, or can benefits come in the form of knowledge and information? I know you talked about sort of sharing.
Again, there's an indicative list in the Nagoya Protocol which has both monetary and non-monetary benefits, and so again, countries in their different bits of national legislation and also in the different agreements or MOUs or transfer agreements or permits that you might agree with them will set out a different set. If you're working with an academic institution like Q, of course, it's not going to be monetary benefits. But if you're working with a commercial company, somewhere like the Brazilian legislation sets out a very clear 1% of profits. So within the new multilateral approach around digital sequence information, that will just be financial, and then the capacity and technology transfer stuff, that would be agreed on a case by case through your own partnership agreements. But of course, those non-monetary, those non-financial things like capacity building, capacity exchange, technology, those are absolutely crucial. Of course, they do also cost money, so it's kind of slight anomaly to say that they're non-monetary. They do cost money, of course. They cost time and money. But if you were a pharmaceutical company entering into a negotiation with a country or community, then it may be that they would set the amount. It may be that would be set. So it is very clearly set in the Brazilian legislation. I think in the South African legislation as well. So you might, it's something that could be mutually agreed between you.
And I mean, are there issues with the sort of implementation being set in national legislation? Do we get issues arising from different countries having different legislation? Do they end up conflicting with each other?
Well, yes, I mean, yeah, there can be a case of, people call it kind of, regime picking. You might choose to work in one country rather than another because it will be maybe clearer, or there will be less restrictions. So yeah, there is that. I think obviously what we have now is the fact that the UK is a party and has got its own legislation. So as users, we do need to now do these declarations to the UK to say that any material that we have utilised in the UK has been collected legally according to national law. So you do need to work out what the different national law is, because the UK compliance people will check, okay, in Ethiopia you need to do this. You need to get this permit. Did you get that permit? In Indonesia you need to get this permit. Did you get that permit? So now we have an internal check on that, and as I said, there will be fines and other penalties for non-compliance. And the UK will then how it works is that you will send all your permits to the UK. They will send them to their counterpart in whatever country you've been working in. They will check that they're the right permits, that you got the right permissions, and that the activity that you're doing, the research that you're doing, is covered by those permits.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to move to a question from Jamie Hudson, who says, I always struggle with the net zero subject because it just seems so far out of reach and almost, dare I say, unattainable. I've seen some research that showed that it would take over 3,000 years to reach. Effectively, it could only be reached with no human beings. And that's a worry for me, especially coming from from world leaders who are questionable, to say the least. Have you got any sort of thoughts or reflections on that comment?
I'm not an expert on climate change. I think I'm sort of my work's more focusing on habitat destruction and overuse of resources. I think there's so much debate around what net zero means and around the different causes of climate. So I think, I can't really answer that, I'm afraid.
Okay, that's fine. And we've got another question from it's rather anonymous. I think it's a set of numbers and letters. They say, if I isolate bioactives from a fungus, do these chemicals become part of chemo biodiversity, and are they globally transportable? So I guess, do they fall under the Nagoya Protocol?
Well, again, it's that thing of, are they covered by your material transfer agreement that you've got in one? We have a case like that in Southeast Asia, and yes, it was covered, though that activity was covered, so it might be. Again, it's about the particular conditions and restrictions that that country might put on. The Nagoya Protocol is like a framework. What you're working with is the individual national laws of the countries that you're working with, and the different transfer agreements, and the different agreements that you entered into with your partner in that country, or with the original transfer of that material.
Yeah. Do you think, I mean, could you say, what do you think is the most common obstacle or sort of issue sort of when trying to sort of confirm compliance with Nagoya? What's the biggest?
I think a lot of it is around, I think that probably a lot of it is around transferring to third parties. So I think sometimes there's clarity on, let's say, we've worked in partnership with Q has worked in partnership with one other country. We know what we can do at Q. Then there's the point where we might want to share material or information with other collaborators, and that can be quite difficult to get the right permissions for, quite time consuming. So I think in terms of science, that's probably the biggest challenge.
Yeah. I really
is
like
having is clarity, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this next question follows on quite well. I really like it. It's nice and simple. This is from Helen. What frustrates you most on a day to day about your job, doing your job?
What frustrates me?
Mm.
Um, I think sometimes that lack of clarity, and I think it's also like my background is law, so I'm fine when it's written what you should do, you know. So if you've got an agreement that says you can't pass this on to another person, that's fine. Then I know I can't pass it on to another person. That's clear. And I think what I find frustrating but also challenging and also really interesting is the kind of ethical gap, the kind of I suppose the policy gap of what should we be doing and when things are unclear, and trying to work that bit out. So I'm fine with clarity. So it's the unclear bit that I find most frustrating.